Welcome back. Today we are moving into chapter 3 in the Buddha's words, and so we've looked a little bit at some background information. We talked last time a little bit more about the birth and some of the things that the Dalai Lama, the Buddha did while he was young, his early teachings kind of thing, the Four Noble Truths and so forth. So the chapter today is called Approaching the Dharma. So part of the idea here is, how do you go about approaching these insights that the Buddha had to help us achieve enlightenment? And so the introduction talks about the diversity of religious and spiritual teachings, various claims that are made, sometimes contradictions that are from one source and another. And we'll look a little later in the class at some more examples of that, because that's not what's in this book per se. And sometimes they feel that their particular religion or sect or group, lineage, whatever, is the one right way. Buddhism as a whole has become fairly open-minded about the other groups, divisions within the overall religion, if you will, of Buddhism. And unlike the degree of fighting and so forth that we see among some other religions, that's not to say that Buddhists have never been involved in fighting, because certainly they have. And so one of the issues that comes up then is, how do we know? How do we know which one is right or true or whatever that might be? Because we don't really have a good way of validating those things. I mean, scholars are making their best effort at trying to sort through those things. But as we've talked about, a lot of what we do have is actually fairly recent. Now, it may go back a very long time, but we don't have the actual texts from those times to see what changes may or may not have been made over that period of time. So it's a little bit hard. So basically, it means that we have to have a level of trust as a part of doing that. And the Buddha talked about that, and one of the examples he gave was the idea of the goldsmith that tests the gold in various ways by scratching it, burning it, and so forth to see whether it was good or how pure it might be, and those kinds of things. And so he suggested that as a metaphor for how we go about this as well. You have to try it out, see if it works. And so even though we've got some diversity, different branches from the Theravada to various forms of Mahayana to the Tibetan, and in many ways they're quite similar, but in other ways they're quite different from each other. So how do you know what works for you? The only way to know for sure is to try it out. You can't just read something and see if that's going to work for you. You might read something to see, okay, yeah, I'd like to try that out. But the best way to do it is to actually try it out. Do a practice for a month or two. See how it works for you. And then if it doesn't work, then move on to something else that seems to work better. According to tradition, at least, the Buddha taught 84,000 different paths. So there are more than one way to make this work. So we look for other things that also work. But he talks about it in this introduction, that one of the ways of dealing with this is called universalism, where pretty much you accept that all of the different religions and traditions are in some way teaching the truth. There's a commonality among all of them, and it's essentially the same thing. As long as we can just find what that kernel of truth is, then we can follow that. And we often endorse ecclesiasticism, is the word he used here, in practice. That is, we can practice things from different kinds of traditions as a part of that, like it's a buffet. And there are lots of people that do that, particularly in this day and age. We see that quite often, and many times they don't refer to it even as religion, but just spirituality. And they're just kind of picking and choosing from the buffet of the things that they like and want. But he goes on to say that with critical reflection, if you really start digging into this, it would show that on most vital issues, the different religions and spiritual traditions take different standpoints. Okay? They give us different answers to our questions concerning the basic grounds and goals of the religion. Sometimes I've heard this universalistic approach that he mentions there compared to different paths up a mountain. But it's all the same at the top of the mountain. But in my experience, and the thing that what he's talking about here is, no, not quite. They may get you to the top of a mountain, but it's not the same mountain. Okay, the view may be nice from any of these, but it's not the same mountain. There are different characteristics of each of those mountains, in spite of the fact that they're all mountains, so they also have some things in common with each other. So that's what he's talking about here. And then he says that it's not only the theistic religions beyond the immediate empirical confirmation, that is, we have no way of proving some of these things, but the Buddha too taught doctrines that you cannot confirm directly in those ways. And he gives some examples. He talks about the universe with many different domains. Well, the different realms, for example, of the the 6 realms, and then the desire realm, form realm, formless realm. There's no way to prove that in any empirical way at this point in time, anyway. Boundlessness of space and time is another one. Wandering from life to life, reincarnation, or karma. Now, these are all things that he taught that have no way of empirically proving, at least at this point in time. Buddhas without number, just countless numbers of Buddhas that are referred to from time to time. And enlightenment after perfections over long periods of cosmic time. The Buddha is said, the Shakyamuni Buddha is said to have lived many, many lives, and over that time he gradually became better at by being a bodhisattva until his last life, during which his time on the earth he achieved final enlightenment, and then at the time of his death what is referred to as parinirvana. But none of these things can be proven. Okay, so there's a certain degree of trust that is required for this, and inevitably we run into questions about whether we must take on board the entire package, or do we have to buy the whole thing? Early Buddhism disposed of that in a single stroke, he says. That direct experience became the ultimate basis for judgment. And that's the teachings, whether they're literally from the Buddha or not, but the goldsmith example that I gave, and there are other examples too, of trying this out, testing it, and if it works for you, and there's a number of teachings by the Buddha where he refers to something at least like that, to try these things out. And that becomes the true test of whether they work or not. So the texts of early Buddhism do not teach a secret doctrine, nor do they teach an esoteric path. And he may be hinting at Tantra here, it's my guess from the way it's described, because Tantra is often referred to as the esoteric path of Buddhism. And the early teachings, at least the ones that we have related to what became the Pali Canon, and other really early teachings, we don't see any of that, in spite of the fact that it is attributed to going back to the primordial Buddha. But it's not attributed to going back to Shakyamuni Buddha. So there's some validity to the way that it's viewed in those two. But it still comes from a Buddha. And they do talk about there being multiple Buddhas in the Pali Canon. So it's not like we're jumping completely out of the tradition when we do those kinds of things. So in the first text in this collection, for this chapter, it talks about the hallmark being wrong views and confused thinking about things. And that's one of the things that gets to be an issue a lot of times. How do we decide what is wrong view or wrong thinking? And this particular text goes into that and helps explain the cases where that is the case. But it does not mean that an ordinary person can fully validate the Buddha's doctrine without special effort. And so it talks about this as being like two different levels. At the first level, when you get in to examine these things and look at them, you can accept the basics. It requires a little bit of trust, but it's not difficult for people to validate that those things seem to be true. But getting into those more esoteric examples that I listed there, those kinds of things, it takes a deeper involvement in the tradition and an understanding, and then you become convinced of the ultimate truth of those things. So that's the way that he describes it in here. He says the Buddha asks us to consider a few simple questions pertaining to our immediate welfare and happiness. Questions that we can answer. So that's where we start, with relatively simple kinds of things. And we talk about suffering and the cessation of suffering. That's the root of what the Buddha is talking about. Most of that has to do with this life. And so even when he goes beyond that to different cosmic time or reincarnation, karma, and all of those kinds of things, it really deals with this life. What are we doing in this life to create good karma, or to purify negative karma that we have, and things like that. So it really does deal with this life ultimately. We're trying to achieve enlightenment in this life, and there are many examples that are given in these texts of people having achieved enlightenment in this lifetime. He talks about what is beneficial, what is detrimental, the need for freedom from harm, sorrow, distress, or the need to achieve well-being and happiness. So it's not sufficient for us merely to hope these things are going to happen. You have to do things in order to make it happen. We have to literally change our brain, rewire our brain by doing these practices. And that doesn't happen by reading a book. It doesn't happen by doing a practice once. It happens by doing it over and over and over again, sometimes taking hundreds of repetitions in order for that to happen. We're all familiar with the Nindra practices, in which we're asked to do things 100,000 times, several different things. So we may be doing 400 or 500 repetitions, 400 or 500,000 repetitions of those things. Not everybody follows that approach. There are different approaches to that particular aspect. But that's some of the things that are out there in terms of how we approach it. But we're rewiring our mind, and that takes effort. It takes persistence and patience and so forth in order for us to do that. It can't just happen overnight. So he then goes on and talks about causes and conditions that are required, and things that lead to harm and suffering, things that lead to well-being and happiness. And so we have to be able to distinguish those. And we talk about virtuous actions that are helpful. We talk about non-virtuous actions that are not helpful. So he provides some guides to us to help us along the way. We don't have to discover it all for ourselves, but we do have to do the practice. So you can look at that set of ethical things about virtuous and non-virtuous and never take them into account in how you live your life. That's not helpful. Okay? You have to take them into account. You have to test them out. And you may find some things that maybe you disagree with, and that's okay. But you have to test them out first. And then the ultimate goal, of course, is liberation from suffering. And then the second text, he kind of gives us an example of this from the Kalama Sutra, the text number 2 here, which deals with some questions about rebirth and karma. And he tells the Kalama people, there's a group of people that were questioning him about these issues, and more generically about some of the other teachings that they had received, and the doubts that they had about those. And he says, that's okay. It's okay to doubt. It's good to doubt. And then you can dig deeper into it to confirm those. So he told them not to rely on 10 different sources of belief, which he goes through here, 4 of them pertaining to scriptural authority, 4 of them to rational grounds, and 2 of them to authoritative persons. So he talks about that in this particular text. And then he is offering simple and pragmatic outlet from doubt and perplexity that may come about in the process. So we're trying to find ways to overcome those. And what are the basic principles that can help us to verify those? He talks about the tacit premise that people are primarily motivated by, or to act by, a concern for their own welfare and happiness. We hear that a lot from our lamas. The Dalai Lama is constantly saying that all sentient beings want happiness and the causes of happiness. They don't want suffering and the causes of suffering. That's what he's talking about. That's an innate thing, and it's a basic assumption in Buddhism that is in fact the case. There are some areas where we get into doubt about that, because we use the label sentient beings. Well, what exactly is a sentient being? And what we find is that the definition in the West of that has to do with senses, our eyes, ears, and those kind of things that we can experience. But in Buddhism, it's a little bit different than that. It has to do with this very basic principle. Can they experience happiness? Can they experience unhappiness or suffering? And so a sentient being can do that. But scientists don't know the answer to that in a lot of cases. And primarily they gauge it based on the brain structure of that being, whatever it might be. So primarily we're talking about lower levels of beings, certainly human beings, and most mammal-type animals and so forth fit into that category. They have sufficient brains to meet that. But what about mosquitoes? The Dalai Lama actually asked that question one time of a scientist, because mosquitoes are very pesky. That in and of itself probably isn't enough reason to kill a mosquito, but that could also cause various illnesses and so forth. Not quite as much in the U.S., but certainly in India, other places, malaria is a big problem, and yellow fever, and there's lots of other kinds of things that can be issues in terms of health related to a mosquito. So he was asking, because I remember one time somebody else asked him, and he said, well, what do you do when a mosquito's coming? And he says, well, first time I just kind of brush it away. It comes back. Second time I brush it away. Comes back again. I don't know if he actually does it or not, but that's what he said at the time. So he said then later on, that because that he's talking to and working with a number of scientists on a regular basis to try and discern the differences, if any, or the similarities between various science applications and Buddhist applications to try and use science to confirm Buddhism. He's even gone so far as to say if science proves that Buddhism is wrong, then we need to change our principles of Buddhism to accommodate that. But he asked a scientist about the mosquito, can they experience happiness or unhappiness? And the scientist said, we don't know. So we can't always have the easy answers to these questions. Some of them we just have to deal with. Anyway, moving on back to the text here, he talks about unwholesome mental states like greed, hatred, and delusion, and unwholesome actions, killing and stealing and so forth. And these eventually rebound, and that's kind of how we look at karma. They come back to us. At a more conventional level in this country, we talk about what goes around comes around. But in karma, we talk about it kind of the same way, but that gets stored, and it may come back in this life or it may come back in a future life. So it has a different level of longevity associated with it. And so those are both unwholesome mental states, unwholesome actions. Well, there are counterparts in the other direction, wholesome mental states and wholesome actions that promote long-term welfare and happiness in the here and now. Again, this lifetime. So the unwholesome mental states lead to reasons for abandoning them. So as we examine those unwholesome ones, we find that we probably shouldn't be doing those anymore because there's lots of negative effects. Wholesome mental states lead to motivation to cultivate them. We discover that there are good reasons for doing this, and so we should emphasize those and train ourselves in those areas. So whether or not there is life after death, one has adequate reasons in the present life to abandon unwholesome mental states and cultivate wholesome mental states. If there is an afterlife, one's recompense is simply that much greater. Okay, that's very similar to what I often say about that, where it really doesn't matter if you believe in karma and reincarnation if you act as if it was true, because you'll do the same kind of things. You'll use the same kind of mental approaches to these issues, these problems, dealing with things in this life, and you'll get the same kind of a benefit out of that. Okay, so I don't think it matters that much, and he seems to confirm that. The third text then talks about how suffering arises and ceases in correlation with present craving. And craving means not just that we would like to have something, but that we really need to have that something. You know, it's a really strong form of grasping at something. And in this text, it's addressed to a lay follower who's very attached to his wife and son. And so he's telling him he needs to back off just a little bit at that. At the outset, we do not require reference to past and future lives, because the teachings have many different sides, is the way he refers to it here. We could look at them in many different ways. And practice does indeed bring joy, peace, and inner security, and this will inspire trust and confidence in the Dharma as a whole. So as we progress then along that line, then we begin to overcome some of those other kind of doubts that we may have had previously when we were first getting started. And then we acquire the faculties needed to validate other aspects such as karma, rebirth, and supersensible realms, is the word he uses here. The various realms outside of the human and animal realms that are obvious to us. Another major problem here is the demands that teachers make for trust. And we've used that word a number of times, but some teachers get kind of demanding that you trust what they teach, that you follow exactly what they say, and so forth. And so we have to be careful about that, especially when a teacher begins to exploit people, which can become quite harmful in how it affects students in particular. Can go the other direction. Sometimes students exploit teachers as well, but that's far more rare. And so we have to be very careful. One of the things that we have is a set of guidelines within our Sangha about that, which deal primarily with the kind of issues that have come up about sexual exploitation. And basically we say it is not okay to exploit anybody for any reason. And then there are some more specific kind of guidelines about other aspects of that. But part of what comes out of that is the idea of actually testing the teacher. Some texts say that you should test the teacher for like 12 years before you decide to follow that teacher. Now that seems even to me to be a rather long period of time to do that. But the principle, I think, is important, that you need to be careful about just diving in because there are good lamas and there are less than good lamas out there. And we have had some here in Tucson who did some things that was, I would say, totally inappropriate for a lama to do. So we do need to be careful about that. Hopefully I haven't done any of those, but let me know if I do. Vimasaka Sutra, number 4, the Buddha lays down guidelines for testing the Tathagata, the teacher, but specifically the Buddha in this case. And one of those is achieving a freedom of the mind from all defilements. And so if you begin having those kind of experiences based on following the instructions of the teacher, then that's a good sign. That's an indication that they are accomplished, that they know what they're talking about, and it's working for you. So evaluating the Buddha's deeds and speech are important aspects of that, and from that we can infer what his mental qualities are as well. But you can just watch the teacher. How does the teacher interact with other people? What does the teacher do in terms of their actions? Do they give teachings that say one thing and then behave totally different from that outside of there? Okay, then that's potentially a problem. And there are certain teachings as well, the crazy wisdom teachings, for example, that can lead to misunderstandings on the part of teachers as well as on the part of students who don't really understand what that is all about. So we have to be careful about those kind of things. But the ultimate test, he says, is practice, a direct knowledge. So again, it just goes back to our own experience by doing the practice. And at the level of stream entry, where we're first getting into this process, it brings what he calls invincible faith. Okay, so we get to the point very early on where we are convinced that, yes, this works for me, I see it working for other people, I think this is a good thing. It doesn't mean I necessarily agree exactly with everything, because there are relative teachings, there are ultimate teachings, and the Buddha said that the relative teachings can contradict each other and so forth. It's only the ultimate teachings that really are unified in all regards, because he was doing teachings for different people with different needs and so forth. So we need to take that into account. So we don't start with faith. We do need a little bit of that, but not blind faith. Buddhism is not about blind faith like some other religions. The idea is you do need a little bit of trust initially in order to do the practices. You have to trust enough to try it out. If you don't trust enough to try it out, you're just not going to get there. Okay? So you only can get there by trying it out. And so this is a prerequisite for trying out the higher levels of training, that you've achieved this little bit higher level of faith in doing this. So in the fifth text, the Kanki Sutra, talks a little bit about this. The Buddha contrasts the preservation of truth with the discovery of truth, which begins by placing faith in a teacher who has proved himself or herself worthy of trust. So you need to have worked with them for a little while, then before you go on into these higher level teachings, before you can accept that. But with the initial breakthrough of stream entry, then you reach eventually then the final arrival at truth. So we achieve liberation. But one must repeat, develop, and cultivate this series of steps over and over and over again. But some people say, well, it's kind of like a circle. You start here and you go through this, and pretty soon you wind back up where you started. And it does look a little bit like that, but I compare it to a spiral. You started here and you go around and you do all of these things, but when you get back to here, you're at a higher level than where you started. Yes, it sometimes looks that way, but that's really not where you are. You've learned a lot in the process of going around. In Zen, there's a saying that first you see the mountain, and then there's no mountain, and then there's the mountain. But it's not the same mountain, okay? It may, on the surface, look like the same mountain, but you have a whole different understanding of what that mountain is at that point. And so all the Dharma teachings have that element embedded in them as well. So he says we have to do this over and over again, and we assimilate it into the supreme truth disclosed, that has disclosed the initial vision. The Dharma is rooted in personal experience. And here's where he says it's not based on blind belief. Faith serves as a spur to practice. Practice leads to experiential understanding, and understanding blossoms into full realization. So we'll take a little short break here.